So I went down 2 decks into my cabin, grabbed a flashlight, knowing I was going to need it in a darkened ship. I went down 2 more decks and started walking toward the back end of the ship on the starboard side. But as I looked toward the back end of the ship, I got my first piece of good news. Because at the back end of the ship, I see lights on. If I've got lights on, I've got a generator running. If I have a generator running, I can get power to pumps, and that's going to allow me to save the ship. So I start walking, and when I get to the middle of the ship, that's where the mess line is. That's where the crew had lined up to start eating lunch. That's also where one of my 3 repair lockers is. Guess what? That one repair locker, it's jammed shut from the force of the explosion. There's no one there. I rounded the corner to take a look at what the mess line would look like. That's what a typical mess line looks like when the crew can line up and slide their trays and get food. What did I see instead? A wall of metal. I don't even think I can walk down the passageway because it is so blocked. So what did I do? I took 2 steps, walked through the door, went to my main medical treatment area. As I walked into medical, it's in the dark and there's no one around. So great. I don't have a medical treatment area, but I've got 2 little battle dressing stations at the forward and back end of the ship that I now have to use for treating the wounded. But there's a great design on ships like USS Cole. The back doors of medical open onto the mess decks. Why? Think about it. The tables are 24 inches wide, 48 to 60 inches long, perfect width and length to take a wounded sailor, lift them up, put them on a table, and do triage to save their lives. But as I open the door to go out onto the mess decks, what do I find? It's in the dark. There's shattered glass, shattered plates, knives, forks, spoons, trays, and food scattered everywhere, and no one is around. So what do? You take a deep breath, you take it all in. I walked over to the port side. When I get over there, you could clearly see this bent door. What's a little difficult to see in the picture is right before the door, the deck is bent up about 18 inches, and just past the door, the deck is bent up at a 60-degree angle. When the explosion had occurred, it had projected into the ship. What had happened? It tore what used to be the overhead and main engine room number 1 and the deck of the galley into 4 major pieces. 1 peeled up and cut off the port side of the ship. 1 slammed forward into my chief petty officer's mess, killing or wounding that mid-level layer of management for the ship. 1 slammed back into what used to be the mess line with the sailors there, crushing and killing several of them. And then another one peeled toward the starboard side of the ship, taking all of the galley equipment and the mess line and shoving it over toward the starboard side. So right there, the left side of the ship is completely cut off for damage control. But as I walk back into the mess decks itself, I see that I actually can walk up and toward the galley area. And when I do, this is what my galley should look like. But as I stood there, that's what the galley actually looked like. But I noticed one thing. I can turn and take 2 steps to the left. And when I do, I'm literally standing at the edge of the blast hole itself. There is nothing inside the ship for almost 25 feet. It is just this gaping open area. You can look down into what's left of number 1 engine room. You can see the water that has flooded the space. You could see the sunlight coming in from the side, and you could hear the water from the harbor lapping. But you could also smell fuel, and lots of it. We estimated that the Yemeni kept pumping on the ship at that 2,000 gallon per minute rate for at least 5 to 7 minutes after the blast. That, coupled with the cracked fuel tanks over the next few days, we'd estimate that we would put almost 100,000 gallons of fuel spilling into Aden Harbor. Now, my apologies right up front, especially here in California. I know everybody's gone green, but I did not fill out a spill report. There are some things you just have to let go sometimes. But it is not what I smell that worries me. It's now what I hear. Because down in what's left of number 1 engine room, amongst all that fuel, you could hear zzz, zzz. It's the popping and the crackling of live electrical wires dipping in and out of all that fuel. So I'm thinking to myself, great, not only have I suffered a devastating explosion, now I'm going to have a major fire on my hands. So I immediately leave this area. I walk back through the darkened mess decks and step out on what is the lighted part of the ship when I came face to face with an earlier decision. When the blast occurred, the announcing system for the ship to tell the crew what to do was knocked offline and the battery backup failed. Because of a design flaw, no alarms on the ship worked. All the cables had been sheared, so nobody could tell us where we were flooding, where there might be fire, where there was smoke. The crew had gathered up all their wounded shipmates, and they had tried to get outside the ship. And what did the captain do? He looked and had seen those orange rafts and had told everyone, get back inside. Only after everyone had been brought back inside the ship did one of the security team members come up to me and say, Captain, those rafts, those are ours. Look. And sure enough, as you looked up and down the entire port side of the ship, all of our life rafts, the concussion from the explosion had blown them out, and that's what had landed in the waters. The 2 garbage barges that had been there, they had left. What had come out, following the same profile, was the 3rd garbage barge, came down the side of the ship with 2 guys in it. They even stood up and waved at the crew, came to the middle of the ship where the 3rd garbage barge was supposed to stop, where the other one had been. It had then blown up. That's what had blown the hole in the side of the ship. But not knowing that, now I come face to face. I was worried about security. The crew had no triage area, so guess what? That back end of the ship, that back end passageway, there's all the wounded stacked up. 2 and 3 sailors working on every one of their wounded shipmates, trying to save their lives. And as I looked down, I would have given an eye tooth as commanding officer to bend down and talk to each and every one of my wounded. But I can't. They are not my number one priority. My number one priority has to be the ship. So I step amongst the wounded, rounded the corner, and I walked up into the central control station. As I walk in, it is a hurricane of activity. To my left, the chief engineer is working with their engineers. What's the status of the generator? How much spare power do we have? What pumps are pumping online? To my right is the executive officer working with the damage control assistant. Where's the damage and what are we doing to isolate it? That's when I made the smartest decision of my command tour. I kept my mouth shut. The last thing I needed to do was walk in and take charge of a situation I had no idea what was going on. So instead, I just stood there and waited for a minute, watched the ebb and flow of communications, and I said, Chief Engineer, XO, when you 2 are ready, tell me what we've got. They came together and briefed me on the status of the ship. On USS Cole, there's 4 main engineering spaces. Up forward is auxiliary machine room number 1. That has our number 1 gas turbine generator that had been running but had been knocked offline and we didn't know how to restart it. Behind that, main engine room number 1, that had my 1 Alpha and 1 Bravo gas turbine engines that powered that starboard shaft that ran the entire length of the ship. Just behind that, auxiliary machine room number 2, that's where the shaft went through it and I had a series of pumps and an air conditioning unit. Right above that is the supply office where I kept all the spare parts for the ship and the documentation for the supply department. Right above that, but not labeled, is my reefer decks where I had my refrigerator, freezer, dry provision storm with about 60 days worth of food on it. And behind that, my largest engineering space, main engine room number 2, 2 Alpha, 2 Bravo gas turbine engines that powered the port shaft, as well as my number 2 generator. My only operating generator was number 3, which is near the back end of the ship. Number 1 engine room had borne the brunt of the blast and had flooded immediately. Starting with auxiliary machine room number 2, we had what's called progressive flooding. AUX 2 flooded, then the supply office, then the reefer decks. Cracks in bulkheads put water forward into AUX 1 and back into main 2. Even though she knew the answer, the chief engineer looked at me and asked a point-blank question. Captain, are we going to lose the ship? I looked at her, knowing these ships just like she did. I said, no. If all we've lost are these 2 sets of spaces, we're going to be fine. The tension level came down by an order of magnitude. The crew refocused their efforts, and we went about saving the ship.